So good morning, and welcome to the Olin Business School at Washington University in St. Louis. This event is also being broadcast via live stream, so welcome to our online audience as well. So the Calhoun lecture series began in 1978 in memory of David R. Calhoun, a local St. Louis business leader. And the purpose of the series is to contribute to the study and discussion of the role of business in a free society. And today we're pleased to continue this series with our great friend Jim Bullard. As I look around at today's audience and in the conversations we've had earlier, I'm delighted to see such an impressive gathering of business leaders, distinguished alumni, and university trustees. Welcome. The Calhoun Lecture Series is supported by the Office of Corporate Relations here at the Business School, where corporate engagements and student experiences meet to create the Olin experience, I guess we could say. And if any of you are interested in further engagement with WashU and the Olin School, please connect with Dorothy Kittner, our Head of Corporate Relations, or someone on her team to explore opportunities. Now, without further ado, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, President and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, James Bullard. Jim oversees the activities of the 8th Federal Reserve District and sits on the Federal Reserve's Federal Open Market Committee, which meets regularly to set the direction of US monetary policy. As a fellow economist, I'm delighted to say research fellow of the Fed myself, I've personally been impressed with the research of Jim and his team, and today's presentation is no exception. His leadership effectiveness has served to put the St. Louis Federal Reserve on the map, and it is with great pleasure that I welcome my friend, Jim Bullard, to the stage.
Thanks very much. Well, thanks very much, Dean Taylor, and thanks to all of you for being here today and coming out to listen to boring economist talk. Hopefully I won't be boring today. I've got an exciting subject, which is standard of living across the country, in some ways the most important topic of all in all of economics, which is what's the standard of living. And I took this on because I think cities are an important part of macroeconomics. Regional economic development is an important part of macroeconomics. And I wanted to center the debate better than I think it's centered in the US about the role of cities. So we're going to talk about metropolitan statistical areas across the country. I have given this talk once before. It was to the bi-state development group in the St. Louis area here. I've changed it slightly from there. I'm going to draw on some recent research at the St. Louis Fed, and is there a Q&A at the end? I guess. Okay, there is a Q&A at the end, so I'm happy to take questions on this. Or if you want to ask questions about monetary policy or anything else under the sun, I'm happy to dodge those questions as well. So the paper, if you want to see an actual paper on this, it is published in the review by my colleagues at the St. Louis Fed. It's listed here. We have lots of regional research at the St. Louis Fed, and you can check out our webpage. These slides are also posted on my webpage. So the motivation for this is to look at international literature on cross-country comparisons, and that's going to be my starting point, but this is only the motivation for what we're going to do. If you look at the international literature on standard of living, it's a big literature, and it has a lot of standards in it. It tries to address the question of which countries are doing well for their citizens, which countries are not doing well. So you want to measure the standard of living across countries. And, why are some countries rich and some countries poor? That's the key question. And again, one of the most fundamental questions in all of economics. So I want to do exactly the same kind of methodology, only for cities across the USA. So I want the same standards that are in the international literature to apply to the regional literature across the country. So if you take a look at the international literature and you read all the papers, I'll save you from reading the papers. You can just look at the chart here. This is what they get. You get real per capita GDP, which is also income. The macroeconomics is circular flow. So real GDP is real income. And then you rank all the countries from highest to lowest, and you take some standard measure of dollars in real terms. You get a picture that looks like this. The US is somewhere over there on the left, very high level of per capita income. So we say US is a rich country in an income sense. And China and India farther over, rivals are farther over to the right here. They have historically been poor. And so we say standard of living is relatively high in the US and standard of living is relatively low in many of these other countries. The standard in the literature is real per capita income. That's the key metric. And so this is the clearest meaning of standard of living. Now, when you look at cities and comparison of cities, like everything else under the sun comes in. I'm throwing all that stuff out. I'm saying, what is the real per capita income in all these MSAs? That's what I want to know, the same way that we do it for countries. So this last bullet point here is very important because people confuse this. The highest level of a standard of living doesn't mean you're the fastest growing. Switzerland is one of the richest countries. I think Norway might be the very richest country in the world today. Doesn't mean it's the fastest growing country. It means it has a really high standard of living. Switzerland, high standard of living. The fast growing countries actually tend to be the ones that are on the lower side. China is one of the fastest, and India, both some of the fastest growing places. So we're just doing the high standard of living, not necessarily the growth rate. And I'll come back to that issue later. So we're going to do everything by MSAs, and so let me talk about MSAs. An MSA is a large population center, and then you look at the commuting patterns around that large population center, and you include counties based on commuting patterns. So this is a standardized methodology. It's the only way to think coherently about what a city is. The political boundaries don't make any sense. Because they go all over the place for different cities. So that's the natural unit of analysis for this talk. You want to talk about an economic entity, and the way to get at that is to talk about the MSA. And since I'm a macroeconomist, I'm very interested in the idea of, well, where's the GDP being created? About 90% of it is in MSAs, although it might be a little deceptive. I'll talk about that as we go through here. But anyway, a large, almost all the production in the country is occurring somewhere in these MSAs. There are going to be 381 MSAs in the US, according to the official numbers. Enid, Oklahoma didn't make the list here for our data. So there would be 382 if you added that one in. About 86% of the population lived in one of these MSAs. So 86% of the population, 90% of the GDP, kind of saying, the GDP is produced where the people are. And then here are some basic statistics. They go from Carson City, Nevada, all the way up to New York City, and they have a median population of about 238,000. It is a very skewed distribution, so you have relatively few very large cities, and then it's kind of like a power law, and it goes down to much smaller places. We're also going to look at a subset, probably maybe more interesting, of the big MSAs, and we're going to take an arbitrary cutoff of 1 million people. There are 53 big MSAs. About 56% of the population lives in these big MSAs. I was a little surprised by that. I thought there was more urbanization maybe in the US than that suggests. This goes from Tucson, Arizona, which would be just over 1 million people, up to New York City. And again, you've got a skewed distribution where the biggest are really big, and then it comes down from there. You got to keep that in mind. I think that's important. It's important to keep in your mind. These places are not the same size. When you watch the NBA or something, you kind of have the impression all these cities are about the same size. No, they're very different size-wise. Here's one of my favorite pictures in this talk, which is the picture of the actual MSA. So the darker ones are the ones over 1 million, and the lighter ones are the ones under 1 million. And this gives you, and then the light gray area, kind of rural areas. So this is where the GDP's being produced in the US, 90% of it. So this is what we're talking about here. And from a macroeconomics perspective, you want these dark blue areas especially to be your high production, really good places, because that's where most of the people are, and that's where most of the GDP, or over half of the GDP is. So this is, the St. Louis, we're going to talk a lot about St. Louis here. The St. Louis MSA then includes lots of counties, goes across the river. It's the whole thing, the whole shebang. And similarly for these other areas, Dallas, Fort Worth here, Houston, you're talking about a definition that includes all these commuting patterns and everything. That's the economic unit we're talking about. Now, the key thing here is that cost of living is different across those MSAs. That's the thing I'm bringing to this discussion. Prices vary greatly across the US. We all know that some places are more expensive than other places, but it's only recently, starting in 2014, that more systematic data have been developed that actually give you a number for the price level in the St. Louis area versus the price level in the New York City area or the Los Angeles area. So the main idea is to use this newer regional price level data to calculate real income per capita across all these MSAs. If we do that, we'll have something very analogous to what's done in the cross-country literature for US MSAs. So these data are called regional price parities, RPPs, and they measure differences in price levels across MSAs. BEA started publishing those in 2014. The data actually go back to 2008. I'm not doing any of that here. I'm just taking 1 year, 2015, which is the most recent year available. These RPPs are expressed as a percent of the national price level. So the national price level is 100. Your city might get 120. That would mean you're an expensive city. Your city might get an 80. That means you're 20% less expensive than the national average. So, and these are all items RPP, so everything's in the basket. And critically, housing is in the basket. So this is absolutely critical to what we're talking about today. But it also includes all other consumption goods and services, healthcare, everything's in the basket. You might say, as an economist, I've often wondered this, why do these prices differ across areas or across regions? Everything's in dollars. If you think of a network of gas stations, you can always go to the next gas station. The next gas station has to compete with the gas station beyond that. If you think about it that way, you should get exactly the same prices all over the country, but that doesn't happen even with gasoline, which is a very competitive product. So what is it that's driving differences? I don't have a reason for everything, but what key reason is housing costs. They're really large, and I like this Zillow example here from 2015. If you take the median home in St. Louis, it's $105 a square foot. If you take the median home in San Francisco, $479 per square foot, a ratio of nearly 5 to 1 in housing costs between San Francisco and St. Louis. This particular example makes me think that what I'm going to say today is understated, that we're understating how expensive the expensive cities really are. But we're going to just take the numbers as they are. So I've got 2 slides here that are pictures, and it's going to try to convince you that these housing costs are critically important. Here's one we got off the web here, blog post on the web. This is an average price per square foot in all these places around the country. West Coast, extremely expensive. Northeast, very expensive. Some special places, Aspen, Colorado, Key West, Florida, Seattle's pretty expensive. Middle part of the country, much cheaper per square foot. So this is one thing you should have in your head as we're talking about this. Here's another picture. This is the Center for Housing Studies at Harvard. This is the share of households that can afford payments on the median house in their area. So for St. Louis, you've got over 2/3 of the households can afford to buy the median house. And on the West Coast, you've got less than 1/3 of the households can afford to buy even the median house. We're not talking about buying the mansion, just the median house. Only 1/3 of households can actually do that. Florida, expensive. Northeast, expensive. Even Chicago, kind of expensive. South tends to be more expensive. If you look at these RPPs, then 59 MSAs were higher than the national average. So it's kind of concentrated. Remember, there are 381 MSAs. 59 of them are expensive places. Some are very inexpensive, like Beckley, West Virginia, about 80% of the national average. Most expensive, Honolulu, 125%. Median is 93%. Average comes out to about the national average. St. Louis, and this is critical here, about 91% of the national average. Okay, so these RPPs are just always expressed as a relative to 100, and 100 is the national average. All right, we're ready to calculate real per capita income across MSAs. So we're ready to go here. We're going to take real income per capita for each MSA and adjust it based on the regional level of prices. So that'll give the standard of living as the average level of real income per person for a particular location, just like in the cross-country literature. So if you do it this way, you're not going to get a median. You're just going to be taking an average, and because of that, you've got some issues that might be circulating in your head. That average could be influenced by the fact that you got a lot of rich people living in that particular MSA, and maybe that's screwing up the calculation. So later in the talk, I'm going to show you some numbers on income inequality by MSA, and the punchline there is all the income inequalities also in the most expensive cities. So I'll show you that. So we're going to use personal income. Another possibility would be look at household income, which is what they do in this Coughlin et al. Paper that I cited earlier. I kind of don't like the household income because you have to define households. What if would they get divorced? Now you have two households instead of one household, and they have different income levels. So I think I kind of like the personal income. It's close. It's just adding up all the income in the MSA, dividing by the number of people in the MSA, cleaner calculation. Then divide by the regional price parity for that particular MSA. We'll get real income per capita. I'm going to focus only on 2015. These data go back to 2008, so you could actually do more here, but we're just going to do 2015. We are getting to the point where we'll have a decade of data. You could start looking at trends across places. So the punchline, this is kind of the punchline slide, so you can wake up now. St. Louis is about 12% higher in real income per capita than the national average. It's of the 53 largest MSAs, St. Louis is number 7. For the complete set of 381 MSAs, St. Louis is 20th, or the top 6%. So another way to say this is 94% of all the MSAs in the US have a lower standard of living than St. Louis. My punchline is that the Midwest tends to do well. St. Louis tends to do especially well, and I'm going to kind of elaborate on that as we go through this. So what I like about this is that in my mind, as coming from the macro and the international literature, this is the way you should think about cities, and this is the way you should think about which cities are doing a good job for their citizens and which cities are not doing a good job for their citizens, okay? So that's my kind of perspective on this. If you look at the complete set of MSAs, you will find that these 53 largest MSAs tend to be on the high side. They tend to be above average in terms of real per capita income. So I'm interpreting that as consistent with Ed Glaeser. Some of you know Ed Glaeser from Harvard. He's kind of the kingpin of cities. He has a book called Triumph of the City. And his story was that cities, the big cities, are kind of the places where a lot happens and a lot's going on for the economy, and it's great stuff. I would say that this is very consistent with what Glaeser is saying. Glaeser also complains bitterly about regulations on the coasts inhibiting the right amount of housing to be built and then making those places really expensive. So he says you should get rid of all those regulations and build more housing in places like that. So if you look, let's do a picture that's like the international picture. This is real per capita income across all the MSAs adjusted by the regional price levels. And you get a picture like this. This is all 381 now. And St. Louis is up here, so 94% of the MSAs are down here. These big, I just pointed out where the big cities are that are kind of the most famous cities. New York's behind, Chicago's behind. LA, here's one here. So LA's actually below average on this kind of calculation. But generally speaking, the 53 largest MSAs are over here somewhere. Only a few of them are over here. Now you might be saying, well, what are these? Who are these guys over here? These tend to be, we're going to see some of them in just a minute here, but the very top is actually Midland, Texas. So if you're a relatively small MSA and you're in boom times, you might do very, very well on this. And with the oil market booming in 2015, still I think Midland, Texas, I think is this number here. Another place that does well, tends to do well, Austin, Texas. Another place that tends to do well is Raleigh-Durham, North Carolina. Okay, but most of what I'm going to talk about is the places that are over 1 million. Just because you have small places, relatively small places like Austin that do well, most of the small places are really over here. So they just don't have enough scale. That's Glaeser's argument. They don't have enough scale to really drive the kind of income per capita that you'd like to see. Here's the 53 largest MSAs. And again, here's LA, New York, Chicago. Here's St. Louis, number 7 on this list. This, I think, is Riverside, California. This is all relative to the U.S. average. So the U.S. average would be 1 here. So only this many of the big cities are below the average. Most of them are above the average. And we're going to see who these guys are here in just a minute. So the point is, basically, Midwest tends to do very well. Here's the top 10. St. Louis here, about 13%, 12 to 13% above the national average in real per capita income, as long as you adjust by the regional price parity. And let's just look at these. Let's just look at this list for a minute and spend a little bit of time on it. San Jose and California and San Francisco are essentially the same place, so you're kind of measuring the same thing twice here. Boston, Hartford, Connecticut. I looked at this MSA. That MSA is basically the middle slice of Connecticut. Connecticut is the richest state in the nation, and you're kind of just taking the middle slice of it, but not Bridgeport and not New Haven, if you know Connecticut at all. So you're kind of taking that whole slice there. It's not just downtown Hartford. It's more than that. So Hartford does very well. Seattle, another tech hub, doing very well. Washington, D.C., and then St. Louis, Nashville, Minneapolis, Houston. So one thing about this is, one way you could divide this up is 3 of these cities are on the East Coast, 3 are on the West Coast, 4 of them are in the Midwest. So I think that the older story would be the Midwest tends to do very well because it has a good combination of lower cost of living and good jobs, and you put those together and you get this high standard of living. Okay, I'm gonna now add to this 2 columns on this thing. What about the high cost versus low cost MSAs? You could think of the, some have a high cost of living, others have a low cost of living. There's kind of 2 ways to get to a high standard of living. One way to get to a high standard of living is have a high cost area but pay really high wages, and then you have a high standard of living. Another way is to have a lower cost area and have good jobs in the lower cost area, and you get a high standard of living. So you could think of those as different strategies for delivering a high standard of living. Only 2 of these cities actually have in the top 10, St. Louis and Nashville have cost of living less than the national average. So one way to do this is just put another column on this table that shows you the RPP for that particular place. So yes, San Francisco and San Jose are high per capita income, but they're also high cost areas. The only 2 that are below the national average are St. Louis and Nashville. So if you guys know anything about Nashville, it's total boomtown today. It's a lot going on in Nashville. Minneapolis, my hometown, Houston, right at the national average, Hartford, Connecticut, at the national average. And then what about income inequality? So a lot of people might say, okay, St. Louis does well, but, lots of problems in the urban area and there are lots of income inequality, and that's why they're coming out high on this list. Not true. So I'm going to show you by looking at another study, because I can't really do the income inequality thing here. I don't have the full data set for each MSA. I'm just taking total income for the MSA and dividing it by the number of people. But there's other research that studied the issue of income inequality across MSAs, these guys here. And St. Louis income inequality is actually near the average, while some of the other top 10 MSAs have higher than average income inequality. So this is a chart that ranks everybody by income inequality, all the MSAs, so this is 381 MSAs. The measure of inequality is the ratio of the average household income of the top 1% to the average household income of the bottom 99%. That's what they used in the other study. The most income inequality is actually Bridgeport, Connecticut, MSA now. You're talking about the MSA, so what do you got there? You got the hedge fund guys living in Connecticut, but you've also got Bridgeport itself and other places that are poorer. And so that adds up to a lot. But here's the main point, New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, these are places with high income inequality. St. Louis is down the list, close to the median here, and these are going to be smaller MSAs, tend to be over here. So it's really the big famous places that have a lot of the income inequality. And you can put this in another column on the same chart now, and you can look at these high income inequality numbers for Boston, San Francisco. We're close to the median. Washington, D.C. does very well on this. So there you have the federal government kind of spreading a lot of jobs across a lot of people, and I think that brings their number down. They're actually the best on this list. Nashville, Tennessee, very similar to us. Minneapolis, Houston, quite a bit of inequality. So this is my final table here, and so my point is that among these top 10 large MSAs, it's really St. Louis and Nashville that are the twins here. They have very similar real income per capita. They have a lower cost of living strategy, if you want to think of it that way, and they have relatively moderate income inequality. So these are the 2 cities that come out best on all 3 dimensions. Higher than average standard of living, lower than average cost of living, moderate income inequality. Well, what about growth? A lot of people say, well, I go to a city and the only thing I look at is how many cranes there are. How many times have you heard that? If you do that, Shanghai is the best city in the world. But this is not about economic growth. This doesn't really tell you anything about economic growth. And not only that, you would expect from the international literature, the high standard of living places are not the fast growing places. Switzerland is not expected to grow rapidly. It's China that's expected to grow rapidly because they're catching up to Switzerland and to the US. And so the same thing here, you would think the same thing would apply here. But the truth is, I don't have enough data here to really kind of carry out that analysis and see if that's really true based on what I've got here. There are a lot of other studies about regional income convergence in the US, but they don't use this regional price parity data, so we've got more to go there and to get to the answer to this question. All right, so I'm going to conclude. I'll open it up for questions then. Again, I'll take questions on this or on anything else. It's critical, if you want to think about this issue, to adjust for these regional price differentials. Most studies that you see do not do this. They just divide by the price level for the nation as a whole. But this is going to, it's giving you a twisted picture of what's going on in the nation because cost of living by these data are different as 30, 40% across these different places and getting worse. I think this will get much worse probably going forward as house prices continue to rise and the supply of housing continues to be constricted in some of the most expensive places in the country. So I've used these regional price parities to calculate real income per capita across MSAs. Again, I think MSAs are the only reasonable unit of analysis here. And hopefully we can do future research here on why some cities are more successful than others, but you have to get a good basis about who's successful and who isn't, and then you have to go from there to think about what can make other cities successful. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. Thanks very much for your kind attention today, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Do I have to stand up?
Yeah, you gotta stand up.
Okay, hi. That was a great talk. Thank you very much. So I'm going to cheat and ask two for the price of one. So,
Okay.
So I know this is a one-year kind of a study, but do you feel that there's like a business cycle, there's a standard of living cycle? And if you think there might be, do you think we're on the uptick or the downtick?
In the growth literature, it's not thought of as being very cyclical. So it's more about identifying long-run trends, and the very long-run trend internationally is up. Just to put a finer point on it, a country for which we have data is the UK. Over the last 200 years, the standard of living in the UK, we're talking about for the average person, increased by a factor of 22. So what is that? That's the Industrial Revolution and everything that's happened over the last 200 years. Most people would say, I think internationally, that is continuing and will continue over the next 100 years as technology diffuses, capitalism diffuses across the world. China and India are now growing. For a long time, we're very stagnant, very poor, but now growing. Other countries will join in that haven't joined in. So I think it's an upward trend internationally. Is it an upward trend across the country or has it stagnated? Some of the literature kind of suggests that maybe it is stagnating or splitting. So I think that's an important issue, but I can't get at it with these data. And what was the second part? Sorry?
How are we doing in St. Louis?
Oh, yeah. Well, again, that's more about growth. So I would say this is a slow-growing right now, slow-growing region with a high standard of living. I think, in the last decade, probably somewhere like Las Vegas is a fast-growing type of place, but Las Vegas doesn't show up very much in this kind of calculation. So, growth is a different issue, I think, than the standard of living.
Speaking about the most recent tax law and the implications of the limits on local tax deductions and mortgage interest deductions, how do you see that affecting the large MSAs, especially the coastal and high-tax cities?
You know, I haven't seen a complete briefing on that, but my basic understanding is that that's a more complicated issue than people appreciate, because there's the different states have different tax codes, and then the different locations, you know, the cities might also have elements in there. So it's hard to make real general statements about, you know, it's going to affect, you know, certain people. One other aspect of that is that you're talking about itemizers. The itemizers are the top end of the income distribution. So, you know, in the tax reform, they increased the personal deduction, basically doubled the personal deduction. So there's supposed to be less itemizers in the future. So this should have less effect than it otherwise would have had. And that effect should land mostly on very high income earners relative to the rest of the country. So I think those are the things that you can say, but the extent to which that's affecting one city versus the other would be very local calculation, I think.
You talked about Chicago, Nashville, and I think MSAs compete regionally. What about Kansas City, Indianapolis, other regional areas?
A great point. So this makes it seem like you'd want to be in a low-cost area, but low cost doesn't do it all by itself. So Oklahoma City was not on here, Memphis was not on here, Kansas City not on here. They're probably all similar cost to St. Louis or lower cost. It's a combination of being a low-cost place plus having lots of good jobs within that low-cost place. And then you put those two together, that's how you get the high standard of living. So, you know, some places are low cost, but just don't have enough job base to drive the high standard of living. I think the complete list, if you want to look at the complete list, it is on the webpage, and you should be able to click and see where everybody comes out on this. You know, one of the slides that I took out is, one thing you might think about is, like, what is the kind of range across all these MSAs? So if you went to the 95th percentile, and then you looked at the 5th percentile, how much difference is there between those guys? And the answer to that is about 35 or 40%. So the standard of living range across the whole country, you know, on the order of 30 or 40%. If you look across countries, the range is much, much wider. It's like at least a factor of 2 across OECD nations, and it's a factor as high, it's controversial, but it's a factor as high as 30 across all countries in the world. So, you know, there's a big difference between the US and India. So we're not talking about that kind of huge amount of difference, but we are talking about a 30 or 40% difference in lifestyle, in standard of living across these different MSAs.
So one of the things we've been watching is the hollowing out of rural America. A lot of young people are moving to urban areas, but also moving from the Midwest to the coast. What do you see trending of how that would affect your data in the long term as younger people are not wanting to stay rural, they're moving to urban, and then cities along the coast are growing faster than cities in the heartland?
Yeah, I think the rural-urban migration, that's been a 100-year phenomenon, and if I understand agricultural technology, it's going to continue. So you're really getting bigger and bigger farms. What I used to think of as an astoundingly large farm is now considered kind of normal or average today. And the technology to you know, have the tractor just do all the thing, you know, program it up and do the whole thing, it's just astounding. So there's so much going on there that I don't think the rural-urban migration is going to change. Now, whether you should go to Miami or you should go to San Diego or Los Angeles or New York City, like my daughter did, you look crazy based on this. Those aren't necessarily the places to go. And I think those of us that have kids that did it, I think they are kind of scratching their heads. Actually, I asked my kids, at one point, both of them lived in New York, and I told them, based on my research, your lifestyle's about, it probably went down about 30%. And then they said, yeah, that's about right. So, it's exciting to be in the big city and everything, and there are many other factors other than this. But I guess what I want to focus on is you look at all these MSAs, and you want to have a good metric for thinking about which ones are really delivering for the average guy, not for the rich guy, for the average guy or the median guy. Which ones are really delivering a good standard of living to their constituents, and which ones are not, and then think of policy, from there. And you could have kind of a high cost strategy, and then you make up for it by also paying high wages. That's maybe one way to go about it. Another way to go about it is to say, let's keep the cost side down, and then we'll also have to have good jobs, but we don't have to pay quite as much as in the high cost places.
Jim, over the last decade, the Fed has picked up the responsibility of having a 2% inflation target. Decades ago, it was felt that having an inflation rate over 1% was not good for the country. And I think you've been a fan of having a range as opposed to a target. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, the Fed has a 2% inflation target. I did a lot of work to get that target. I think my thinking was it was more important to have a target than actually exactly what the target was, because there's a lot about that. It says that inflation is a responsibility of the central bank, and it does something to hold the central bank accountable. Are you delivering or not on the target that you stated? So it's kind of management 101. And I thought it was very important to be able to say, here's what we're trying to do. That stabilizes expectations in the economy and gets everybody to coordinate and understand. And then you have to deliver, and you have to try to hit your 2% target. So I think there are a lot of good things came out of the 2% target. And so there's a lot to be said for just leaving it alone and keeping it the way it is. There's a lot of talk now about, well, we missed our target on the low side for 5 years in a row. Maybe we should review it. Maybe we should review how we go about setting monetary policy in order to hit the inflation target. I think those are all great topics for discussion. But in the big picture, I think it was an excellent thing to name the target and insist that the central bank try to hit the target. That coordinates expectations. So that's been a good thing. Now, should it be 2%? Should it be 1%? Some people would say price stability should be 0%. That's something I've actually worked on in my research, but I think it's more important, just setting the target is more important than the actual number at the end of the day. This idea about a range, I've actually been lukewarm about a range. I think if you have a range, then if you're in the middle, it suggests that you're not going to do anything or you're going to go to sleep while you're in the middle, and I'm not sure that's a great thing. And then as you get closer to the edge of the range, then maybe you'd take more aggressive action. So in some ways, I think it might create more problems than it solves to have a range. So far I haven't been blown away by the arguments about a range.
The regional price parity data seem to be driven a lot by housing costs, which is a bit of a lagging indicator. Do you have any ideas about maybe what some of the root cause indicators are that are driving down that cost across some of these MSAs, or maybe driving it up as well?
So why is the housing cost a lagging indicator?
Thinking of it as it's the end result of desirability of living in that MSA, what people are willing to pay on the market.
Well, I think Glazer would say there's a bunch of crappy policies that are protecting homeowners and real estate owners in these various places, and so they don't want more building to occur. They want their own prices to go up, and he would say, get rid of all that and allow more stuff to be built, and then you would get sensible prices in New York City and San Francisco. But because that's not happening, this happens everywhere to some degree. All of us that own property are not too anxious to see a big subdivision built right next to us is going to make our home worth less. So this is a kind of endemic problem. But I would push back again just slightly against the idea that it is not it's a lagging indicator. So what you're doing is if you look at the inflation measurements, how they really work, you're computing imputed rent. So what would you have to pay to rent your house out, which has always been a controversial calculation, but that's what you're talking about. And then these rents actually are moving around month to month. So you are getting a signal about how things are progressing month to month. So I don't think it's a matter of these things were built 10 years ago and then they took a long time to come online. I think you are getting a measure of those prices. Sort of the consumption value of the house, that's really what you want to know. You're trying to get that in the price level index. So I think it is timely.
How would you expect your conclusions to change given a rising interest rate environment?
Well, these are stories about longer run trends and not so much about day-to-day monetary policy. I don't think, certainly higher interest rates make housing less affordable, so it would enter a little bit on this calculation, but I don't think it would fundamentally alter what I did here.
Going back to the housing, I believe the St. Louis metropolitan area is, I would think the trend over the last 10 years is below average home appreciation, and that has to impact
yeah, like I say,
worth.
I think if you're thinking strategically about this region, I think the trends favor us because probably the coasts will get even more expensive than they are today, and we probably will get somewhat more expensive, but not as fast as the coasts, and so therefore we're going to benefit from this trend. That's what I would think. And the Midwest generally, I guess, would benefit from this trend.
Hi, I was wondering.
We're randomly passing the mic.
Hi, I was wondering if there's been any thinking at the Fed by you or other Fed presidents about incorporating asset prices into a more general, broad-based sense of inflation, and if there hasn't, why not?
Great question and longstanding topic. If you write down models, then the models say that the prices that matter are the prices for consumption. So you want something like a consumption basket, and then you want to look at the prices in that consumption basket. So that's the core idea. And then the question would be, well, what about assets? Because you're also saving for retirement and send your kids to school and to buy a house. You're saving over here, and you got to pay prices over here. But those are investments. That's been the thinking. Those are investments that you're going to later sell off so that you can consume, and then you'll pay the consumption prices again. So it's hard to get the idea that you should include asset price inflation as part of the inflation basket or the measures of inflation. So it's been an uphill climb for those that wanted to make that argument. I think there's a different argument, which is that the asset prices can get out of line somehow, and then they can collapse on you, and that causes a recession. That looks like what happened in the housing bubble. It also looks like what happened in the late 1990s. To get that to work in a model is not that easy either, but I think a lot of people are very sympathetic to that idea that somehow there gets to be misalignment in some asset prices, and when it comes back into line, it causes a lot of disruption in the economy. So that's where we are in that debate.
Jim, thank you. This is wonderful, great research and welcome news in many respects. But I have a question around the relationship between standard of living as
you've defined it, and what I might loosely call quality of life. For example, the research based on income level versus costs of living weighted doesn't perhaps, or does it, take into consideration the fact that one community might have higher quality education or higher quality medical care or whatnot, and how those differences relative to services within those communities relate to standard of living and conceivably quality of life. Does that make sense to you?
I mean,
for example, if Minneapolis has wonderful schools,
yeah,
and Nashville has poor schools,
yep.
based on the delta relative to their income and expenses, one draws a conclusion, but in fact, Minneapolis might have a much higher quality of life because the schools are superior.
Yeah. So when you look at the kind of the journalist style rankings of cities, then they'll bring in all kinds of stuff, other considerations, other than real per capita income. And because I'm a macro guy, I'm insisting you go right back to the hard numbers. Sure, you could say a lot of things about, and you could say this in the cross-country rankings as well. Norway is actually the richest country per capita, but their neighbor, Finland, has the best educational system. So should I rank Finland ahead of Norway, or should I rank Norway ahead of Finland, or what? So I think also, like, Brazil is going to come lower on the list in real per capita income. But then I might say something like, well, Brazil's a beautiful country with a long coastline, and therefore I'm going to move it up in the rankings because of that, because that's a nice amenity compared to Uruguay, which is the landlocked country. Yeah, I don't know. To me, that's all, you can do that, but that's all kind of arbitrary, because what we're trying to do is get economic systems that give the most back to the average guy that's living in that particular area. And we want to study what is it about, what kinds of policies can we pursue that are going to help that average person, or that median person, and also to keep the income inequality down to reasonable levels. What kinds of things can we do? And if you start bringing in all these, and maybe education is part of that. Maybe education is a driver, and that's certainly been thought of in the international literature, but I'm not sure it really pans out as well as you think it would. There are African countries that have extremely high literacy rates, but are very low standard of living and low growth. So it's not so clear what drives everything. This is just about data. So to me, this is the starting point, and then you bring in other considerations from there and think about policies from there. What is it that, look at it this way. St. Louis is 13% above the national average. What if every city in every MSA came up to St. Louis level? We might not all get to San Francisco level, but maybe we can get everybody to St. Louis level. GDP in the US would be 13% higher. I'd be giving everybody in this room a raise of 13% in real terms. That would be great, but how can we get that to happen? What is it that's driving success in the various places?
So a little bit off of your research, but what's the culture like at the top of the Fed? So like the other folks that own each representative bank, do you guys collaborate a lot? Is it simply let's go in and vote? And how do you guys kind of drive, the organization as a whole, just from a culture perspective?
Well, it's a matrix-based organization. The banks are set up as individual entities and corporate. They have a corporate culture, and they're not government. So we do. It's not civil service or anything like that. So we do expect performance and fire people if they don't perform. So it's more businessy. The Board of Governors is more like a government agency and has more of a feel like that. And then the executive team, which is really the governors plus the presidents, runs the system as a whole. We have a lot of committees, we have a lot of system-wide initiatives, and the trend in the Fed has been more toward that type of activity versus the original conception was, a person like me would run the St. Louis Fed, and then we never had to talk to anyone else. But that's all breaking down because everything has to be done as a system. So we actually get along extremely well. People know each other very, very well. We have lots of meetings all around the different facilities around the country. I'll give you one example. I'm the CEO of the St. Louis Fed, but I'm also the chair of the Information Technology Oversight Committee. That is a spend of about $1.4 billion for the whole Federal Reserve System. We try to drive strategy for security, for productivity, and other things within system IT. And so my colleagues on there are the president of Richmond Fed, president of the Dallas Fed, and others. And so there's a lot of opportunity to work at the system level in addition to working at the bank level.
This is fascinating research. Could you talk about what it will be used for a little more, and what actions, possible actions you could see either from the Federal Reserve or local governments or businesses?
Yeah, I can talk. That's a great question. I'll talk just a little bit about what I'd like to see going forward. So keep in mind, these RPPs, which are the central thing here, these regional price parities, they didn't exist before 2014. No one had done this. And so when you were comparing cities, you just said the price level's the same in New York City as it is in St. Louis, and you didn't make any adjustment for that, and then you went on and did your analysis. So this is an improvement on that, and these differences are pretty big, 30, 40%. It seems to me you should always be doing this now going forward when you're thinking about comparing places to live across the country. And now you can start to ask, this is a way to level set the debate and say, okay, here's where the real per capita income is and here's where it isn't. And now you start to say, which policies are really driving that? Is it that Minnesota has a great education policy? Is it that San Francisco has a lot of innovation going on, or Seattle, a lot of innovation going on? Or is it that Houston is kind of Wild West attitude about how they want to run their MSA? What is it that could be successful? Or are there multiple strategies that could be successful? Can they be copied by other cities? But what was done here is to level set, here's what the playing field is. And also this growth question, high standard of living does not mean fast growth. So you might be high today, but others might be catching up. And so that's a big question as well. So I think there's a lot that can be done now going forward, and I'd certainly encourage any students here to look into this and think about this going forward. Okay, you guys have been very great. Thanks very much. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks, Jim. Absolutely fascinating talk. And certainly personally for me, having lived, thinking about international, national comparisons, having lived in the UK and the United States, and I've lived in, I think, 4 cities now in the US, including both the East and the West Coast. And I can honestly say, it's great here. And we have a small gift for you, Jim. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much.